Okay, back on the front of your paper. For us to really get into all of the details and work to really distinguish the things that are happening in this process, we have to go a little bit into our history to try to understand how elections used to work. So 1968 was a major turning point in the way that we choose presidential candidates. It was a turning point in terms of how you and I will have opportunities to vote. And so if you think about the way that we choose presidential candidates in America today in 2016 looks incredibly, incredibly different than it did in 1916. And a huge part of that is because of the fact that parties and state legislatures are largely in control of this election process. Remember, the Constitution says relatively nothing about it. Okay, I'm going to show you a video clip from the 1968 election or Democratic National Convention, and then kind of talk you through what actually was happening.
For Democrats, the Chicago Convention of 1968 was a nightmare. Leading after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, Democrats fell into chaos, fighting Chicago police and each other.
With George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Mr. Daley is not pleased with Senator Riddick.
How hard it is to accept the truth.
Vice President Hubert Humphrey, hobbled by the unpopularity of President Johnson and his Vietnam War policies, appealed for order.
Surely we have now learned the lesson that violence breeds counter-violence, and it cannot be condoned, whatever the source.
It didn't work. Humphrey's November defeat ushered in the era of Republican presidential dominance, with 7 GOP victories in the last 10 elections.
Okay, so in 1968 and prior, when states would have their competitions within each of their states, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party would have their competitions where people would go and they would express their will and they would say, okay, this is who we want the party to choose as a presidential candidate. Those competitions were considered advisory. They were not necessarily binding. Rarely was it an election. Very often it was more of a meeting type thing, like a caucus that we're going to talk about in a minute. So in that particular election in 1968, the Democratic Party chose Hubert Humphrey to be their nominee, meaning that Humphrey is now going to run against the Republican candidate in the 1968 presidential election. Hubert Humphrey had not even been an option for most Democrats across the country. So you had people in Texas or people in California or people in Nevada who wanted to say they wanted to influence who the Democratic Party was going to choose, but Humphrey wasn't even like a name that they were throwing out there because Humphrey wasn't the person they wanted. There was actually an anti-war candidate, Eugene McCarthy, which was actually like a lot of people had supported him. So remember, in 1968, pretty tumultuous time in general. There's like more active, more physical political participation, and like it really showed, right? Because the Democratic Party is supposed to be the party of the people. We've got civil rights going on, all this kind of stuff, and the party messed up big time because they chose a person that the voters didn't actually want. So here's what's going to happen. Between 1968 and 1972, the Democratic Party is going to have this thing called the McGovern-Fraser Commission. The objective of the McGovern-Fraser Commission, and you do need to write this down, the objective of the McGovern-Fraser Commission is to reform this process, to reform the process of how the Democratic Party chooses presidential candidates. They said that they wanted the process to become more open. They wanted it to have more diverse representation. Remember, we've just gone through the civil rights movement where we have finally gotten rid of the literacy tests, and we've gotten rid of like the grandfather clauses. You know, we have worked to actively ensure that suffrage is a reality for any eligible citizen in this country. So the McGovern-Fraser Commission says we want to have more diversity at the National Convention. We want to allow women to go to the National Convention. We want to allow non-white people to go to the National Convention. prior to 1968 or 1972, conventions were old white guys. I mean, they were like party elites. They were people who kind of like ran the machine and gave a lot of money and donated stuff. 1972, we don't want that to happen anymore. So I'm now going to show you what is a campaign commercial for 1972. George McGovern is actually going to be a Democratic Party candidate in 1972. And it's going to show you the differences in what you just saw from 1968 and what you now see in 1972. Now remember, this is a campaign commercial, so it's obviously like guided, but I want you to see what the convention is like.
It was almost dawn in Miami when the final moment came. But the lateness of the hour did not dim the emotion in that hall. For the victory they celebrated was not his alone.
My nomination is all the more precious in that it is the gift of the most open political process in all of our political history.
The reforms had worked, for in Miami that night were people from the entire length and breadth of their party. Some were professionals, many were amateurs, but they all were Democrats, and they all shared the belief that this year, each of them would make a difference.
I'm a housewife and a mother and a dairy farmer. I have one son, 17, and he was very anxious to do the driving. And so he offered to take me down, but he also told me if I didn't vote correctly, I'd walk home, and his vote was for McGovern.
I've been in politics since 1960, and I think that's a difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to begin with. I think the Democratic Party is the party of the people, the ones who care.
There were only 3 from the delegation that had never been to a convention before. We were all new, and we didn't have a moment's free time. The first night went 10 hours.
People feel as if there's no way they can influence what happens. And I always felt that way. And in fact, that's the really great thing about I went to the National Democratic Convention, you know. A lot of people say, oh, you lost prime time by being up all night. Well, that to me was great. And every delegate that was there stayed there and stayed with it.
The state senators and the members of the House of Delegates and all of these new people really worked hard.
The everyday person in our section, they were making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and salami sandwiches right there on the convention floor because they didn't have the money to eat in the hotels and restaurants. It wasn't a convention to play. The Miami people, the hotel people, and the restaurant people were very unhappy because we didn't play.
We worked hard on the floor, and we had freedom of the floor to work in the way that we wanted to work.
Miami people are able to participate, and because they're participating, then the politicians, or he in this case, will have to listen to what the people say. He's going to respond to the people.
People were voting on their own conscience. I saw that myself. I saw democracy happening right there on the floor.
We all moved together. This was great. We worked as a team. It was just fantastic. It was the first time I've ever seen anything that's supposed to not work.
This is the people's nomination, and next January, we will restore the government to the people of this country. Let the opposition collect their $10 million in secret money from the privileged few, and let us find 1 million ordinary Americans who will contribute $25 each to this campaign, a million-member club with members who will not expect special favors for themselves, but a better land for us all.
The contributions of 200,000 ordinary Americans had made him their nominee. He would need 1 million more to make him their president. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C. McGovern.
Okay, so really, like, the whole point of that is just to see how the convention went from being controlled by party elites to being something that legitimately normal, regular citizen people who are willing to participate could actually go to the convention. And remember, the purpose of the convention is to choose the presidential and vice presidential candidate. So if you guys will stop and flip your paper over and look at question 2. Question 2 says, what led to the McGovern-Fraser Commission on Convention Reform, and to what extent does the increase in reforms make the selection of candidates more democratic? I do want to note here that I've just been talking about the Democratic Party all along. That's because that's where the trouble started, and that's where the reforms started. The Republican Party is going to adopt all of these reforms as well. So the Republican Party also had the same process, and they're going to end up modeling, like adopting the reforms that the McGovern-Fraser Commission puts in place. So now, even though some of the rules are different, the integrity, or generally the heart of the process is very much the same. So take a couple of minutes with your table mates, and let's see if you guys can formulate an answer to question 2.